On a quiet hillside overlooking the Willamette Valley in Oregon, there stands a mansion that holds more than just rooms and walls. It holds dreams that changed the world, a fortune built from nothing, and a heartbreak so profound that even all the wealth in America could not heal it. This is the story of Phil Knight, the man who turned a simple idea about running shoes into a global empire called Nike. But it's also the story of what happens when success collides with loss, when a father's greatest achievement becomes a backdrop to his deepest sorrow. The mansion sits among towering Douglas firs and rolling hills, its windows looking out over valleys that have watched Oregon transform from timber country to tech hub. Inside those walls lived a family that represented the American dream. A self-made billionaire, his devoted wife, and their children who grew up surrounded by both privilege and purpose. But wealth, no matter how vast, cannot protect against the cruelties of fate. And within this beautiful estate, a tragedy unfolded that would forever change not just the Knight family, but the very meaning of their fortune. To understand this house and the shadows it holds, we must first understand the man who built it. Phil Knight was not born into wealth. He did not inherit his empire from powerful ancestors. Instead, he started with an idea so simple that most people would have dismissed it as foolish. He believed that better running shoes could change athletics. He believed that with enough persistence, even a small company from Oregon could compete with giants. And against all odds, he was right. Philip Hampson Knight was born on February 24, 1938, in the city of Portland, Oregon. His father, William Knight, was a lawyer and newspaper publisher, a man who valued hard work and discipline. His mother, Lota Knight, came from a family that had deep roots in Oregon's history. They were comfortable but not wealthy, respectable but not privileged. Young Phil grew up in a world where success had to be earned, where dreams required sweat and sacrifice. From his earliest days, Phil Knight was an athlete. He loved to run, feeling the wind against his face, the rhythm of his feet against the ground, the simple purity of pushing his body to its limits. In high school, he was a middle-distance runner, not the fastest on his team, but determined and disciplined. His coaches saw in him something beyond raw talent. They saw persistence, the quality that would later define his entire life. When he enrolled at the University of Oregon in the late 1950s, Knight joined the track team and met a man who would change his life forever. Bill Bowerman was the university's track coach, a legend in running circles, known not just for training champions, but for his obsession with improving athletic equipment. Bowerman believed that shoes could make the difference between winning and losing, between injury and health. He spent hours in his garage, cutting apart shoes, experimenting with materials, trying to create something lighter, faster, better. Knight watched this obsession and absorbed it. He began to see shoes not as mere products, but as tools of transformation. After graduating from Oregon, Knight continued his education at Stanford Business School, but his mind kept returning to running shoes. During his time at Stanford, he wrote a paper exploring a simple idea. What if a company could import high-quality, low-cost running shoes from Japan and sell them in America? The established American brands charged high prices for shoes that weren't particularly innovative. Japanese manufacturers, Knight theorized, could produce superior products at lower costs. It was basic economics, supply and demand, but it was also a vision of disruption. Most students write business school papers and then forget them. Knight did not. After graduating in 1962, he flew to Japan with barely any money and no real business experience. He visited the Onitsuka Tiger Company, which made quality running shoes but had little presence in America. Walking into their offices, Knight introduced himself as the representative of Blue Ribbon Sports, a company that existed only in his imagination. He had no inventory, no warehouse, no employees. Just ambition wrapped in a lie bold enough to sound like truth. The Japanese executives were intrigued. This young American seemed passionate about their products, knowledgeable about running, and confident about the American market. They agreed to let him distribute their shoes on the West Coast. Knight left Japan with samples and a handshake deal, knowing he had just committed himself to building something from absolutely nothing. When he returned to Oregon, Knight needed help. He turned to his old coach, Bill Bowerman, proposing a partnership. Bowerman would use his expertise and connections in the running community. Knight would handle the business side. Each man put in $500. Blue Ribbon Sports was born, operating out of Knight's car, with shoes stored in his parents' basement. For years, Knight worked a day job as an accountant, while selling shoes at track meets on weekends, carrying boxes in his trunk, setting up makeshift displays on folding tables. The early years were a grind that would have broken most people. Knight lived paycheck to paycheck, borrowing money from his father, sleeping in cheap motels, driving endless miles to reach small track meets where he might sell a dozen pairs of shoes. His friends thought he was wasting his Stanford degree. His family worried he was chasing a dream that would never pay off. But Knight believed. He believed in better shoes, in Bowerman's innovations, in the growing running culture he could feel emerging across America. Slowly, word spread among runners. The Tiger shoes were lighter, more comfortable, and cheaper than the established brands. Bowerman continued experimenting, creating new designs that Knight would bring to market. Sales grew from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands. By the early 1970s, Blue Ribbon Sports was bringing in over $1 million annually. But success brought new challenges. The relationship with Onitsuka became strained. The Japanese company wanted more control, threatening to cut Knight off and distribute directly in America. Faced with losing everything he'd built, Knight made a bold decision. He would create his own brand, design his own shoes, control his own destiny. In 1971, Blue Ribbon Sports became Nike, named after the Greek goddess of victory. The iconic swoosh logo was designed by a Portland State University graphic design student named Carolyn Davidson, who was paid just $35 for the work that would become one of the most recognized symbols in the world. The first Nike shoes were revolutionary. Bowerman, experimenting in his kitchen one morning, poured rubber into his wife's waffle iron, creating a sole with better traction and cushioning. The waffle sole became Nike's breakthrough innovation. Athletes noticed the difference. Performance improved. And suddenly, Nike was not just another shoe company. It was the future of athletic footwear. But even as his business grew, Knight remained a private man, uncomfortable with publicity, focused on building rather than boasting. He married Penelope Parks in 1968, a woman he'd met in Portland during the early days of his business. Penny, as everyone called her, was intelligent, grounded, and supportive of her husband's seemingly impossible dream. She worked alongside him in those early years, helping with accounting and operations, believing in the vision even when it seemed hopeless. As Nike expanded through the 1970s, the Knights started a family. They had 2 sons, Matthew and Travis. The boys grew up watching their father build an empire, attending track meets, meeting athletes, understanding from an early age that their family was different. Their father wasn't just successful, he was transforming an entire industry. By the 1980s, Nike had become a household name, sponsoring the greatest athletes in the world, from Michael Jordan to Bo Jackson, creating advertising campaigns that transcended sport and became cultural touchstones. With success came wealth beyond imagination. Phil Knight became a billionaire, one of the richest men in America. But he never lost his connection to Oregon. While other tech billionaires moved to Silicon Valley or New York, Knight stayed in the Pacific Northwest, building Nike's headquarters in Beaverton, just outside Portland. And when it came time to build a home worthy of his success, he didn't choose Manhattan penthouses or California beach estates. He chose the hills of Oregon, the land he'd always loved. The Knight family estate sits in the hills outside Portland, in a region known for its natural beauty, with rolling terrain covered in forests and farmland. The exact location has always been kept private, shielded from public curiosity by gates and distance and the Knight family's preference for discretion. Unlike the flashy mansions of other billionaires, this estate was built not for show, but for family, for privacy, for the kind of peace that only comes from being surrounded by nature. The main house is substantial but not ostentatious, designed in a contemporary Pacific Northwest style that blends wood, stone, and glass. Large windows frame views of the landscape, bringing the natural beauty inside, connecting the interior spaces to the forests and hills beyond. The architecture respects its surroundings rather than dominating them, a reflection of Knight's personality, powerful but understated, successful but not showy. Inside, the home was filled with the symbols of an extraordinary life. Signed jerseys from Nike athletes hung in custom frames. Prototype shoes from every era of the company's history lined shelves in the study. Photographs captured moments with sports legends, presidents, and innovators. But among all these markers of achievement, the most important things were simpler: family photos, the laughter of children, the quiet dinners where the Knights could be just a family rather than an empire. The estate included everything the family loved: tennis courts where the boys could practice, trails winding through the forest where Phil could run, still finding peace in the rhythm of his feet against the earth. A library filled with books about business, sports, and history. Gardens where Penny could cultivate beauty. It was a sanctuary, a place where the pressures of running a global corporation could fall away, where Phil Knight could be not the Nike founder, but simply a husband and father. For years, this sanctuary seemed perfect. The boys grew up confident and curious. Matthew was particularly close to his father, sharing his love of adventure and exploration. He attended university and developed a passion for travel and diving, exploring underwater worlds with the enthusiasm of someone who wanted to see and experience everything life could offer. He was the kind of young man who seemed to have everything: intelligence, privilege, kindness, and a future without limits. After completing his education, he began working for Nike, learning the business from the ground up, just as his father had insisted. But Matthew had a restless spirit. He loved diving, exploring underwater worlds, pushing himself to see and experience things beyond the comfortable boundaries of his privileged life. In the summer of 2004, while on a diving trip in El Salvador, Matthew decided to explore a deeper section of the ocean. He was an experienced diver, confident in his abilities, but the ocean is indifferent to confidence. Something went wrong. Whether it was equipment failure, disorientation, or simply the cruel randomness of nature, no one knows for certain. What is known is that Matthew Knight, 34 years old, son of a billionaire, never surfaced. The news reached Oregon like a lightning strike. In one moment, everything changed. The mansion that had been a sanctuary became a tomb of grief. Phil Knight, the man who had overcome every business challenge, who had built an empire through sheer determination, found himself facing an enemy against which all his success meant nothing. No amount of money could bring Matthew back. No deals could be negotiated with fate. The man who had always believed that persistence and hard work could solve any problem discovered that some losses are simply permanent. Penny Knight was devastated beyond words. A mother's grief is a private ocean, deep and dark and impossible to fully describe. The house that had echoed with family gatherings and holiday celebrations now felt empty, haunted by the absence of the laughter that would never return. Travis, Matthew's brother, tried to hold the family together, but he was grieving too, processing the loss of his brother, his friend, his childhood companion. In the days and weeks after Matthew's passing, the mansion became a place of mourning. Friends and family arrived to offer condolences. But what can anyone say in the face of such tragedy? Phil Knight, who had spent his life surrounded by the world's greatest athletes, achievers who never quit, who always pushed through pain, now faced a pain that could not be pushed through. There was no solution, no strategy, no innovation that could fix what had been broken. The Nike headquarters in Beaverton went quiet. Employees who had worked alongside Knight for decades struggled to find words. The company that had been built on the motto, "Just do it," now faced a loss for which there was nothing to do. Nike had always been about achievement, about pushing limits, about victory. But this was defeat in its most absolute form. In his grief, Phil Knight made a decision that would reshape his life's priorities. He began to step back from day-to-day control of Nike, handing more responsibility to other executives. The empire he had built no longer seemed as important as it once had. What did market share matter when measured against the loss of a son? What did profits mean when the person you'd hoped would inherit your legacy was gone? Instead of retreating entirely into sorrow, Knight channeled his grief into giving. He had always been philanthropic, donating millions to the University of Oregon and other causes. But now, his giving took on new urgency and meaning. In 2007, he and Penny donated $100 million to create the Matthew Knight Arena at the University of Oregon, a state-of-the-art basketball facility that would honor their son's memory. The arena stands today as a monument not just to Matthew, but to the idea that even in loss, something beautiful can be created. The Knight family continued supporting education, athletics, and cancer research. Phil Knight became one of the most generous philanthropists in America, giving away billions to Stanford, Oregon, and medical research institutions. But those who knew him understood that the giving was not just about legacy or tax benefits. It was about trying to make meaning from meaninglessness, trying to transform grief into good, trying to ensure that Matthew's life, though cut short, would have continuing impact. Back at the Oregon estate, life continued, but it was forever changed. The house that had once been filled with the noise of family gatherings now held longer silences. Phil Knight still walked the forest trails, but his runs were slower, more reflective. Penny tended her gardens with the kind of focus that comes from needing something, anything, to nurture and care for. Travis visited regularly, understanding that his presence was now even more precious to his parents. The mansion itself became less important. It was still beautiful, still surrounded by the stunning Oregon landscape, but it was no longer the center of the Knight family universe. Phil and Penny spent more time at their other properties, including a home in Hawaii, where the memories were less painful, where they could be surrounded by new scenes, rather than constantly reminded of what they'd lost. Nike continued to thrive even as its founder stepped further into the background. The company he'd started with $500 in a car trunk was now worth tens of billions, employing thousands, influencing culture around the world. But for Knight, the company's success felt different now. It was still important, but it was no longer everything. He had learned what many successful people learn too late, that achievement and wealth, while important, are not what give life its deepest meaning. Family is, love is, and both can be taken away without warning. In interviews, rare and carefully controlled, Knight sometimes spoke about Matthew. His voice would grow quiet, his eyes distant. He would talk about his son's curiosity, his kindness, his potential. He would mention how Matthew had wanted to understand the world, to see things most people never see, to live fully rather than safely. And then Knight would stop, the emotion too close to the surface, the wound still too fresh even years later. The estate in Oregon remained in the family, but it changed character. What had been a celebration of success became a reminder of fragility. The rooms where Matthew had grown up stayed much as they were, a private museum of childhood that his parents could not bear to change. His books remained on shelves. His belongings stayed in closets. It was as if, by keeping everything in place, they could pretend that he might someday return. Visitors to the estate, the few who were invited, felt the weight of this grief. They saw the beauty of the architecture, the stunning views, the markers of extraordinary success. But they also sensed the emptiness, the permanent absence that no amount of wealth or achievement could fill. The mansion had become a monument to a truth that wealth tries to obscure, that we are all vulnerable, that tragedy does not respect status or success, that life can change in an instant. Phil Knight aged in the way that grief ages a person. His hair turned white, his face grew lined, but it was his eyes that changed most. They held a sadness that success could not erase. He remained involved in business, in philanthropy, in supporting the university that he loved. But the drive that had once consumed him, the burning need to build and achieve and conquer, had been tempered by loss. He had learned that winning is not everything, that some games cannot be won, that the most important things in life cannot be bought or built or earned through persistence. Penny Knight threw herself into charitable work with even greater intensity. The Penny and Phil Knight Cancer Research Center, the Knight Cardiovascular Institute, numerous education initiatives, all became vessels for the couple's grief and generosity. If they could not save their own son, perhaps they could save others. If they could not undo their own tragedy, perhaps they could prevent future tragedies for other families. The University of Oregon, always close to Knight's heart, became one of the primary beneficiaries of this transformed giving. Beyond the Matthew Knight Arena, the Knights funded academic buildings, research centers, and programs that would educate generations of students. In a sense, Oregon became the recipient of the energy and resources that might have gone to grooming Matthew to take over Nike. The university became a kind of surrogate heir, carrying forward the Knight family's values and impact. As years passed, the Nike empire continued evolving. Phil Knight eventually stepped down as chairman, watching from a distance as new leaders took the company into new eras. He had built something that would outlive him, an organization that touched billions of lives, that changed how people thought about sports and achievement and self-expression. But he also knew that when his own life ended, the headline would not just be about Nike. It would also mention Matthew, the son lost too soon, the grief that wealth could not heal. The Oregon estate stands today much as it did before tragedy struck. The Douglas firs still tower over the property. The views across the Willamette Valley remain breathtaking. The house itself, though showing the gentle wear of time, is still beautiful. But it carries a different meaning now. It is not just a mansion, not just a symbol of success. It is a reminder that life's most important stories are not about wealth or achievement, but about love and loss and the ways we try to make meaning from both. Occasionally, from the trails that wind through the Knight property, hikers might catch a glimpse of the estate through the trees. They might wonder what it's like to live in such a place, to have such resources, to have achieved what Phil Knight achieved. But if they knew the full story, they might feel differently. They might understand that the mansion's true story is not about triumph, but about the limits of triumph, about the questions that success cannot answer, and the pain that wealth cannot soothe. In the broader context of Oregon's history, the Knight estate represents a particular kind of Pacific Northwest success story. Unlike the old timber barons or the tech billionaires of Seattle, Knight built his empire on something more abstract, on brand identity, on the psychology of achievement, on the power of a swoosh symbol that came to represent aspiration itself. His wealth was different from inherited fortunes or resource extraction. It came from understanding what people wanted, even before they knew they wanted it, and then giving it to them better than anyone else could. But the estate also represents a particularly American kind of tragedy. In a nation that worships success, that believes in the power of will and work to overcome any obstacle, the Knight family's loss stands as a sobering counterpoint. Here was a man who had achieved everything the American dream promises, and yet he could not protect his family from random tragedy. The ocean that took Matthew Knight did not care about Nike's market capitalization or Phil Knight's net worth. Nature is indifferent to human achievement. As Phil Knight moved deeper into his 80s, the question of legacy became more pressing. Nike would continue, its swoosh logo forever linked to his name. The charitable foundations would keep giving. The buildings at Oregon bearing the Knight name would keep educating students. But what about the estate itself? Would it remain in the family, passed to Travis and his children? Would it eventually be sold, becoming just another luxury property with no connection to its history? Or might it, like some estates of other philanthropists, become an institution itself, perhaps a retreat for artists or scholars or entrepreneurs? These questions remained unanswered, kept private within a family that had always valued discretion. But whatever happens to the physical property, the story it represents will endure. It is a story about the American dream and its limitations, about ambition and loss, about building empires and losing what matters most. It is a story that challenges the narratives we tell ourselves about success, forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about what wealth can and cannot do. The Nike Corporation, now headquartered in a sprawling campus in Beaverton, stands as Phil Knight's most visible legacy. Employees there, walking past buildings named after legendary athletes and innovative designers, might not think much about the founder's private life. They focus on the next shoe design, the next marketing campaign, the next quarter's results. But occasionally, when they see the Matthew Knight Arena on the Oregon campus, or when they hear older employees mention the founder's son, they remember that even this empire of achievement was built by a man who knew profound loss. For those interested in the architecture of wealth, the Knight estate offers an interesting study in contrasts. Unlike the Gilded Age mansions of the East Coast, or the sprawling compounds of tech billionaires, the Oregon property reflects a different aesthetic. It is large but not gaudy, expensive but not flashy. It speaks to a kind of Western American wealth that values privacy and understatement, that measures success not by how much you display, but by how well you live. This aesthetic, common in the Pacific Northwest, suggests that true luxury is space and solitude, views and nature, rather than chandeliers and marble. The gardens at the estate, carefully maintained over decades, represent Penny Knight's influence. She had always believed that beauty was important, that creating and nurturing living things was a worthy pursuit. After Matthew's death, those gardens became even more significant. Each season's bloom was a reminder that life continues, that beauty persists even in the face of loss. The roses that returned each spring, the bulbs that pushed through winter soil, the trees that grew year after year, all testified to nature's indifference to human sorrow and also to its capacity for renewal. Phil Knight's study in the mansion held the accumulated wisdom of a business lifetime. Books on strategy and leadership lined the shelves alongside biographies of athletes and innovators. But mixed among the business texts were other books, philosophy and history, and memoirs about loss. In his later years, Knight was trying to understand not just how to build companies, but how to live with tragedy, how to find meaning when the meanings he'd spent his life constructing suddenly seemed inadequate. The relationship between the Knight estate and the surrounding community was always complex. Oregon takes pride in Phil Knight's success, in the fact that a homegrown company became a global powerhouse. Nike provides thousands of jobs, pays millions in taxes, and supports countless local causes. But there is also awareness that such concentrated wealth exists in a state where many struggle, where the gap between private estates in the hills and the lived reality of working-class Oregonians is vast and growing. Knight himself seemed aware of this complexity. His philanthropy, particularly his support for public education and medical research, suggested a man trying to balance private wealth with public good. The hundreds of millions donated to Oregon's public university system represented a belief that success carries obligation, that those who have benefited from society's structures should reinvest in those structures. Whether such giving is sufficient to address inequality is a debate that extends far beyond one family or one estate. In the rooms of the mansion, time accumulated in layers. The Nike memorabilia from the 1970s and 80s, artifacts from when the company was still fighting for market share, sat alongside items from Nike's era of dominance. The evolution of the brand could be traced through these objects, from the early waffle sole shoes to the Air Jordans that changed sneaker culture, to the high-tech performance wear that now defines the company. Each item represented not just product development, but cultural shifts, changes in how Americans thought about sport and fashion and self-expression. The tragedy that marked the family also marked the company in subtle ways. After Matthew's death, Nike employees noticed a change in how the company approached risk and safety. Programs for employee wellness expanded. Discussions about work-life balance, once secondary to discussions about market share, became more prominent. It was as if the founder's personal loss had rippled through the organization, creating awareness that success means nothing if it comes at the cost of what truly matters. For Travis Knight, growing up in the shadow of Nike and then losing his brother created a particular kind of pressure. He eventually followed his own path, becoming involved in animation and film production rather than sportswear. His company, Leica, produced critically acclaimed stop-motion films that earned Oscar nominations. In pursuing art rather than commerce, Travis perhaps honored his brother's memory by choosing passion over expectation, by building something meaningful on his own terms, rather than simply inheriting his father's empire. The Oregon landscape surrounding the Knight estate changes with the seasons in ways that residents of other regions rarely experience. Spring brings explosive green growth as winter rains give way to warmer days. Summer turns the hills golden and dry. Fall paints the landscape in reds and oranges. Winter wraps everything in gray mist and soft rain. Through all these changes, the mansion endures, its windows reflecting the shifting light, its walls holding the memories of all the seasons the family has witnessed together and apart. From certain angles on certain days, when fog fills the landscape and only the highest points of estates are visible above the white sea, the mansion can look almost like something from another world. In those moments, it is easy to imagine it as a place where billionaires live happily ever after, isolated from the struggles of ordinary life. But the reality inside those walls tells a different story, one without a fairy tale ending, one where wealth and tragedy coexist in uncomfortable proximity. The story of Phil Knight's Oregon estate is ultimately a story about what endures and what doesn't. The mansion endures, solid and beautiful on its hillside. The Nike empire endures, its influence touching billions of lives. The charitable foundations endure, continuing to fund research and education. But Matthew Knight does not endure, except as memory, as absence, as the permanent reminder that some things cannot be built or bought or willed into being. As evening settles over the Oregon landscape, lights begin to glow in the mansion's windows. Inside, perhaps Phil and Penny Knight sit together. Two people who have lived an extraordinary life, who have seen heights of success most people can barely imagine, and depths of sorrow that success could not protect them from. They might talk about Nike, about philanthropy, about the grandchildren who represent the family's future, or they might sit in comfortable silence, two people who have shared both triumph and tragedy, who understand each other in ways that transcend words. Outside, the Oregon night deepens. Stars appear above the trees. The forest sounds grow louder as daylight fades, and the mansion stands watch over it all, a monument not to success alone, but to the full complexity of human experience, to the ways that joy and sorrow intertwine, to the truth that even the most magnificent homes cannot shield us from life's hardest lessons. In the end, this is what makes the Knight estate significant. It is not just another billionaire's mansion, not just another symbol of American success. It is a place where the promises of achievement met the limits of achievement, where dreams came true and then shattered, where a family learned that winning is not everything and that some losses are permanent. The walls hold these truths quietly, offering no easy answers, only the reminder that we are all, regardless of wealth or status, vulnerable to the sorrows that make us human. And so the mansion remains beautiful and sad, a shelter and a memorial, looking out over the landscape where Phil Knight first dared to dream that better shoes could change the world, never imagining that even after changing the world, he would face a change he could not control, a loss he could not overcome, a grief that all his success could never heal. On Christmas Day, 1945, in a quiet seaside room in La Jolla, California, a woman took her final breath. Her name was Ethel Mars. She was 61 years old, and she had spent the last decade of her life chasing a dream that had belonged to her husband. A dream built on chocolate, tragedy, and the rolling hills of Tennessee. But on that cold December morning, far from the estate she had poured her heart into, Ethel Mars closed her eyes for the last time. And somewhere in Giles County, Tennessee, a magnificent manor house stood empty for the first time in 15 years, its windows dark, its barns silent, its future uncertain. Within months, the property that had once employed nearly 1,000 workers during the darkest days of the Great Depression would be sold. The prize-winning horses would be scattered to the winds. The elaborate mausoleum on the hillside, still containing the remains of the man who built it all, would be opened, and his body moved to a cemetery in Minneapolis. Milky Way Farm, named for the candy bar that had made its creator one of the wealthiest men in America, was about to begin its long, slow descent into decay. But to understand how a place of such magnificence could fall so far, we must go back to the beginning. Not to the green hills of Tennessee, but to a small town in Minnesota, where a sickly boy learned to make candy from his mother while the world carried on without him. The boy who learned to dip chocolate. In the autumn of 1883, in a modest farmhouse in Walden Township, Minnesota, Franklin Clarence Mars came into the world. His father was a grist mill operator from Pennsylvania. His mother, Alva, was a quiet woman with a talent for making sweets. From the outside, young Frank seemed destined for an ordinary life. But fate had other plans. When Frank was still a child, disease swept through his small frame. Polio, the great crippler of that era, left him unable to walk normally for years. While other children ran through fields and climbed trees and played games in the summer sun, Frank Mars was confined. His legs would not carry him. His body would not obey. He watched the world through windows, always on the outside looking in. But his mother refused to let her son surrender to despair. Day after day, she brought him into the kitchen. She showed him how to measure sugar and cream. She taught him the delicate art of hand-dipping chocolate, how to coat each piece just so, how to temper the mixture to achieve that perfect shine. For young Frank, these lessons became more than entertainment. They became an escape. They became a purpose. What neither mother nor son could have known then was that these informal lessons, born from necessity and love, would one day create an empire worth billions. The boy who could not run would one day walk with a cane through the halls of a mansion so grand that even millionaires gasped when they saw it. But that triumph was still decades away. First would come failure. Crushing, repeated, seemingly endless failure. The young candy maker's trials. By 1902, Frank Mars was 19 years old. His legs had recovered enough to allow him some mobility, though he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He had married a schoolteacher named Ethel Kissack, and together they had a son they named Forrest. Frank was determined to turn his candy-making skills into a business. He opened a small wholesale candy operation in Minneapolis, selling homemade sweets to local shops and drugstores. The business failed. Frank tried again in Seattle. Again, failure. He moved to Tacoma, Washington, hoping for a fresh start. But Tacoma already had an established candy maker, the Brown and Haley Company, famous for their almond roca. Frank's little operation could not compete. By 1914, he was bankrupt. His creditors took everything, even his personal belongings. His first wife, weary of poverty and broken promises, divorced him and took their son Forrest to live with her parents in Canada. Frank Mars was alone, penniless, and discredited. He was 31 years old, and every venture he had ever attempted had ended in ruin. Most men would have given up. Most men would have accepted defeat and found some quiet corner of life to fade into. But Frank Mars was not most men. The same stubbornness that had kept him learning candy recipes while other children played would now keep him rising from the ashes of failure after failure after failure. In 1910, Frank married again. His new wife was another woman named Ethel, though her surname was Healy. Like his first wife, she was willing to work alongside him. Unlike his first wife, Ethel Healy had an iron constitution for hardship. She would need it. The family that rose from nothing. In 1920, Frank and Ethel Mars arrived in Minneapolis with $400 in their pockets. This was all they had. $400 and a lifetime of experience in failure. They rented a tiny space in the Midway district between St. Paul and Minneapolis, chosen because deliveries to either city cost only a nickel by trolley. The family lived in rooms above a one-room factory. Every morning, Frank rose at 3 a.m. to make candy. Every day, Ethel packed the sweets into boxes and rode the streetcar to sell them to retailers. For 3 years, they scraped by. The business was not failing, but it was not thriving either. Frank experimented constantly, searching for something that would make his candies stand out from the dozens of other small confectioners flooding the market. Then, in 1922, something remarkable happened. Frank's estranged son, Forrest, now 18 years old and a student at the University of California, reached out. The details of their reunion are surrounded by legend and contradiction. Some say Forrest was arrested in Chicago while working a summer job selling cigarettes and called his father to bail him out. Others claim the meeting was more conventional. What everyone agrees on is what happened next. Father and son sat together, perhaps for the first time in years. Forrest was drinking a malted milkshake, and supposedly, somewhere in that conversation, he said something that changed everything. "Dad," he reportedly suggested, "if you really want to make a great candy, take this flavor of malted milk and put it inside a candy bar." Whether the story is true or simply company mythology, Frank Mars went back to Minneapolis and created his masterpiece. He combined rich chocolate, fluffy nougat, and smooth caramel into a single bar. He called it the Milky Way, named perhaps for the malted milk that inspired it, perhaps for the glittering dreams it represented. In 1923, the Milky Way candy bar hit the market. In 1 year, sales leaped from $72,000 to nearly $800,000. By 1930, Mars Incorporated was generating over $24 million in annual revenue. Frank Mars, the boy who could not walk, the man who had failed at everything he touched, was suddenly one of the wealthiest candy makers in America. But with success came complications, and the greatest complication of all was his own son. The rift between father and son. Forrest Mars was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. After reuniting with his father, he joined the company and quickly began pushing for expansion. He wanted to take Mars global. He wanted to sell Milky Way bars in Canada, in Europe, in every corner of the world. He believed his father was thinking too small, but Frank Mars had spent decades fighting for survival. He had built his success carefully, methodically, one candy bar at a time. He was not interested in gambling everything on wild dreams of global domination. He was content with what he had. Father and son clashed repeatedly. Forrest would implement new ideas, and Frank would countermand his orders. Old employees remembered that Frank was proud of his son, but refused to let him run things. The tension built and built until by 1932, it reached a breaking point. According to legend, Frank finally confronted Forrest directly. "This company isn't big enough for both of us," he supposedly said. "Go to some other country and start your own business." He gave Forrest $50,000 and the foreign rights to the Milky Way formula. Then he showed him the door. Forrest Mars, bitter and humiliated, sailed for England. There, he would eventually create the Mars Bar, the Maltesers, and lay the groundwork for what would become M&M's. But he would not speak to his father for the remaining years of Frank's life. The two men, bound by blood and candy and mutual stubbornness, would die unreconciled. And while Forrest built his own empire across the ocean, Frank Mars turned his attention to a different kind of dream. Not a business dream this time. Something more personal. Something that would stand long after his candy bars were eaten and forgotten. He would build himself a kingdom, the search for paradise. In 1930, with millions flowing into his bank accounts, Frank Mars began looking for something money could not buy anywhere else. He wanted peace. He wanted beauty. He wanted horses and cattle and rolling green hills stretching toward the horizon. He wanted, perhaps, to create the childhood he had never been able to have. He and Ethel traveled south, establishing a regional office for Mars Candies in Nashville. And somewhere along the dusty roads of rural Tennessee, Frank Mars fell in love. 8 miles north of the small town of Pulaski in Giles County, he found what he was looking for. 2,800 acres of the most beautiful farmland in Middle Tennessee. Rolling hills that caught the morning light just so. Rich soil that promised abundance. A landscape that looked like it had been painted by someone who believed in paradise. Frank bought it all. He hired architect James F. Drake to design a manor house unlike anything Tennessee had ever seen. Tudor Revival style, with exposed beams and soaring ceilings and enough rooms to house a small village. 21 bedrooms, 14 bathrooms, 25,000 square feet of living space. But the house was only the beginning. Frank wanted barns, 30 of them at least, painted in the green and white of his Milky Way candy wrapper. He wanted cottages for workers, 70 of them scattered across the property. He wanted a racetrack for the thoroughbred horses he intended to breed. He wanted fences, 35 miles of pristine white fencing crisscrossing the landscape. He wanted roads, 20 miles of private lanes winding through his domain. He wanted everything, and he had the money to get it. A lifeline during the darkest days. Construction began in 1931. The timing could not have been worse for America, but could not have been better for Giles County. The Great Depression had descended upon the nation like a plague. Banks were failing, businesses were closing, millions of workers were unemployed, with no prospects and no hope. But in rural Tennessee, Frank Mars was hiring. At the peak of construction, between 1931 and 1933, more than 800 men worked on Milky Way Farm. In a county devastated by economic collapse, this single project became the largest employer for miles around. Workers quarried local limestone for the buildings, giving them a warm, golden hue that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Craftsmen carved elaborate woodwork for the manor house. Laborers cleared land and built fences and dug the foundation for what would become the most magnificent private residence in Tennessee. Frank Mars was known to be generous to his workers. He gave them free candy bars, small loans when they needed them, and treated them with a respect that was rare among wealthy employers of that era. Many workers lived on the farm with their families during construction, creating a temporary community united by labor and hope. For the people of Giles County, Milky Way Farm was not just an estate, it was salvation. It was proof that even in the darkest times, good fortune could still find you if you were willing to work for it. The manor house rises. By 1932, the manor house was taking shape, and even workers who had spent months on the project gasped when they saw what they had built. The main hall featured exposed wooden beams soaring 40 feet toward the ceiling. The fireplace was large enough to burn entire logs. The floors were made of polished hardwood that creaked softly underfoot, and the windows were positioned to capture every moment of Tennessee light from dawn until dusk. But the true marvel of the house was the dining room table. It was so large that it had to be built inside the room itself because there was no way to move it through the doors. 28 feet long and 12 feet wide, it could seat 40 guests with ease. Local legend held that it was the largest private dining table in all of Tennessee. The woodwork throughout the manor was crafted from American chestnut, a species that was rapidly being wiped out by blight across the eastern United States. Frank Mars had unknowingly preserved a small piece of arboreal history in his walls and ceilings. Those chestnut beams would outlast nearly every living American chestnut tree in the country. Outside, the grounds were landscaped with magnolia trees, creating one of the largest magnolia plantations in the South. A swimming pool and tennis courts provided recreation. Secret doors and hidden passageways throughout the house added an air of mystery that delighted visitors. When the manor house was finally complete, Frank Mars must have stood on its grand porch and looked out over his domain with satisfaction. He had created something permanent, something beautiful, something that would last. He had no way of knowing how little time he would have to enjoy it. The horses and the dream of glory. For Frank Mars, Milky Way Farm was never just about the house. From the beginning, he planned to create a breeding operation for thoroughbred racehorses that would rival any in the country. The racing silks of Milky Way Farm would one day be seen at Churchill Downs, at Saratoga, at all the great tracks where fortunes were won and lost in 2 minutes of thundering hooves. The barns he built were monuments to this ambition. The thoroughbred show barn, with its polished stone walls and winding staircase leading to an upstairs apartment, was designed to house champions. Smaller barns dotted the property, each maintained to meticulous standards. The racetrack carved into the Tennessee hills allowed horses to train without ever leaving the farm. Frank also bred Hereford cattle, Hampshire sheep, and show mules. Every animal on Milky Way Farm was meant to be a prize winner. Every aspect of the operation was designed for excellence. And then there were the personal touches that revealed the heart beneath the magnate. Frank named his new candy bar, the Snickers, after one of his favorite horses. The horse had died, but its name would live on, becoming one of the best-selling candy bars in history. For a brief, shining moment, everything seemed possible. Frank Mars had his paradise, his horses, his cattle, his magnificent home. He had proven every doubter wrong. The sickly boy from Minnesota had built an empire of sweetness, but his body had never fully recovered from the polio of his childhood, and the years of struggle and stress had taken their toll in ways he could not see. The shadow falls. By 1934, Frank Mars was showing signs of decline. His heart and kidneys were failing. The man who had risen so high was now fighting a battle he could not win. In April of that year, Frank traveled east, perhaps seeking treatment at the renowned Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. For 10 days, he lay in a hospital bed far from his beloved farm, his condition deteriorating. The doctors did what they could. It was not enough. On April 8, 1934, Franklin Clarence Mars slipped away. He was 50 years old. He had owned Milky Way Farm for less than 4 years. He had never seen his horses race at Churchill Downs. He had never watched his thoroughbred breeding program reach its full potential. The manor house, the barns, the rolling hills stretching toward the horizon, all the dreams he had poured into that Tennessee soil would now belong to someone else. His body was brought back to Milky Way Farm and placed in an elaborate mausoleum on the property. He would rest, at least for a time, in the paradise he had created. And control of everything, the farm, the candy company, the future, passed to his widow, Ethel. The widow takes command. Ethel Mars had spent nearly 25 years by her husband's side. She had helped him sell candy from streetcars when they had nothing. She had watched him rise from failure to failure until finally, miraculously, he succeeded. She had shared his dream of Milky Way Farm from the beginning. Now, at 50 years old, she found herself alone with an empire to run and a legacy to protect. The candy company fell primarily to her half-brother, William Krupenbacher, who had been one of Frank's first salesmen and knew the business intimately. But Milky Way Farm belonged to Ethel, and she threw herself into it with a passion that surprised everyone who knew her. If Frank had dreamed of racing glory, Ethel would make that dream come true. She expanded the thoroughbred breeding program. She spent lavishly at the Saratoga yearling sales, building one of the most impressive collections of racing stock in the country. Between 1935 and 1942, she was a major buyer at every important horse auction. The results were spectacular. In 1935, her filly Forever Yours was named American Champion 2-year-old filly. In 1936, Milky Way Farm's racing winnings totaled over $200,000, making it the most successful stable in the entire United States that year. In 1937, Her filly Mars Shield won the prestigious Kentucky Oaks. Year after year, the green and white silks of Milky Way Farm appeared at the top racetracks in America. Year after year, Ethel Mars proved that she was not merely preserving her husband's dream. She was expanding it. But there was one race that mattered more than all the others. One prize that had eluded her despite all her spending, all her careful breeding, all her determination. The Kentucky Derby. The race of a lifetime. For 6 years, Ethel Mars had sent horses to Churchill Downs on the first Saturday in May. From 1935 to 1940, Milky Way Farm entered 8 horses in the Kentucky Derby. Twice, in 35 and 37, her horses finished third, but the winner's circle remained tantalizingly out of reach. Then came Galahadian. He was a gangly bay colt, long-strided and light-framed, standing 16 hands and 3 inches tall. Ethel had purchased him for $5,000 at the Saratoga yearling sale, a bargain price for a horse of his breeding. His sire was the legendary Sir Galahad III, who had already produced 3 Kentucky Derby winners. His dam sire was Ray Count, winner of the 1928 Derby. As a 2-year-old, Galahadian showed promise but nothing exceptional. He won just 1 race in 5 starts. But trainer Roy Waldron saw something in the colt that others missed. He believed Galahadian was a late developer, a horse who would find his stride when it mattered most. In 1940, Galahadian began his campaign on the West Coast. He won the San Vicente Stakes at Santa Anita and finished second in the Derby trial. It was enough to earn him a spot in the Kentucky Derby field, but the oddsmakers were not impressed. The favorite that year was Bimelech, owned by the legendary Colonel Edward Riley Bradley. Bimelech had been the 2-year-old champion of 1939 and was considered by many to be the best horse of his generation. The betting public made him the shortest-priced favorite in Kentucky Derby history up to that point, with odds of just 40 cents on the dollar. Galahadian, by contrast, was an afterthought. He went off at 36-1, and Ethel Mars was not even there to watch. A cold, severe, and persistent had kept her home. After 6 years of trying, after nearly $600,000 spent on horses, after dreaming and hoping and praying for this one moment, she was lying in bed while her horse prepared to run the race of his life. The sweetest upset. On May 4th, 1940, 90,000 people packed Churchill Downs. They had come to watch Bimelech claim his coronation as the greatest horse in America. The barns were crowded, the new bleachers filled to capacity, and every rooftop commanded a view of the track below. 8 horses broke from the starting gate. Jockey Carol Bierman, aboard Galahadian, settled his horse into 4th position on the rail as they thundered down the backstretch. Ahead of him, Bimelech was running his race exactly as expected, stalking the leaders and waiting to make his move. As they entered the home stretch, the crowd roared. Bimelech had taken the lead. Victory seemed assured, but Bierman had been saving ground along the rail, and now he asked Galahadian for everything the colt had left. The bay horse responded. In the final 16th of a mile, Galahadian swept past Bimelech like a ghost. The favorite, exhausted and beaten, could only watch as the long shot pulled away. Galahadian crossed the finish line a length and a half in front, shattering expectations and silencing the massive crowd. The payoff was staggering. Those few who had bet on Galahadian collected $72.40 for every $2 wagered. Back in her sickbed, Ethel Mars received the news by telephone. The race she had dreamed of winning, the victory her husband had never lived to see, had finally come to Milky Way Farm. Galahadian had done what 8 previous horses could not. It was the greatest moment in the history of the farm, and it would also mark the beginning of the end. The long goodbye. In the years following the Kentucky Derby triumph, Ethel Mars began to slow down. Her health, never robust, started to fail. The war years brought rationing and restrictions that made it difficult to maintain the massive operations at Milky Way Farm. And perhaps, having achieved the one goal that had driven her since her husband's passing, she found herself without the will to continue. Gradually, she began selling off her thoroughbred stock. The racing colors that had once dominated American tracks appeared less and less frequently. The breeding program that had produced a Derby winner was quietly wound down. By 1945, the Milky Way farm racing operation had essentially ceased to exist. That March, with Ethel's health declining rapidly, the farm itself was sold. The new owners were not racing enthusiasts. They had no interest in continuing the Mars legacy. The horses were dispersed. The elaborate operations that had employed hundreds of workers during the Depression were shut down. 9 months later, on Christmas Day, Ethel Mars drew her final breath in La Jolla, California, far from the Tennessee hills she had worked so hard to transform. She had kept her husband's dream alive for 11 years. She had achieved heights of racing glory that most owners never reach. But in the end, she was alone, exhausted, and far from home. Shortly after her passing, the elaborate mausoleum at Milky Way Farm was opened. Frank Mars's remains were removed and transported to Lakewood Cemetery in Minneapolis, where a private family vault had been constructed. Ethel would eventually join him there, reunited in death with the man she had supported through poverty and failure and success. But the empty mausoleum remained standing on the Tennessee hillside, a monument without a purpose, a reminder of what had been lost, the slow decay. What happens to a palace when its royalty depart? What becomes of a dream when the dreamers are gone? For Milky Way Farm, the answer was neglect. Slow, creeping, relentless neglect that would span more than half a century. The new owners tried various enterprises over the years. The property changed hands multiple times. Each new owner promised restoration, improvement, revival. Few delivered. The magnificent barns, painted in their green and white Milky Way livery, began to fade. Roofs leaked, wood rotted, stone walls crumbled. The cottages that had once housed hundreds of workers during the Depression stood empty, their windows broken, their porches collapsing. The racetrack where Galahadian had trained grew over with weeds. The white fences that had once stretched for 35 miles fell into disrepair, their pickets toppling one by one. Even the manor house, the crown jewel of Frank Mars's vision, began to show its age. The polished floors grew scuffed. The American chestnut beams darkened with decades of dust. The massive dining table, still impossible to move, sat alone in its grand room, hosting no one. Locals would sometimes drive past the entrance gates and remember stories their grandparents had told them. Stories of the Candyman who had saved their county during the worst days of the Depression. Stories of prize horses and glamorous parties, and a time when Milky Way Farm had seemed like the center of the world. But those stories grew fainter with each passing year. The failed resurrection. In 2007, hope briefly flickered. A development company called New Horizons Communities purchased Milky Way Farm for a reported $10 million. They announced ambitious plans to transform the property into a luxury residential community with 750 to 900 homes, an equestrian club, a horse track, polo fields, a golf course, and miles of trails. The manor house would be preserved, they promised. The historic barns would be restored. The legacy of Frank and Ethel Mars would be honored, even as the property was modernized. But ambition is not the same as execution, and 2008 brought a financial crisis that made the Great Depression seem almost quaint by comparison. By May of 2009, the development company had fallen ill and the property had entered foreclosure. The grand plans evaporated. The homes were never built. The golf course remained unplanted, and Milky Way Farm, which had already endured 60 years of decline, faced an uncertain future once more. The estate stood abandoned again, its fate hanging in the balance. There was talk of demolition, talk of subdivision, talk of simply letting the buildings crumble until nothing remained but foundations and memories. For a moment, it seemed as though Frank Mars's paradise might disappear entirely. The unexpected saviors. But then, in 2010, something unexpected happened. A father and daughter named Charles Jones and Lynn Golden began purchasing sections of the former Milky Way farm. Piece by piece, they reassembled over 1,100 acres of the original property. They were not developers seeking profit. They were not investors looking for returns. They were simply people who recognized that something precious was about to be lost and decided to do something about it. Working with the Tennessee Land Trust, they placed the front acreage in permanent agricultural easement, ensuring that it could never be developed. They began the painstaking work of restoration, repairing roofs and barns that had been crumbling for decades. They attacked the problems one by one, knowing that the work would take years and cost fortunes. In 2018, Lynn Golden and her sister Catherine Hanley took over the property and continued the restoration efforts. Their mission was simple but profound: to be good stewards of a historic landmark, to honor the God who created its beauty, to maintain the legacy of its founder, and to reignite the pride of those who had worked so hard to make Milky Way Farm a Tennessee treasure. Today, the estate is slowly coming back to life. The manor house is open for tours, and visitors can walk through the same rooms where Frank Mars once entertained guests, beneath those towering chestnut beams. The grand dining table still stands in its original position, too large to ever be moved. The secret doors and hidden passageways still delight those who discover them. Weddings are held in the restored barns and scenic overlooks. Corporate events bring new life to the property, and the rolling hills, still dotted with magnolia trees, still stretch toward the horizon as they did nearly a century ago. What remains? Walk through Milky Way Farm today, and you walk through layers of history. The stone walls built by Depression-era workers still stand, a testament to craftsmanship and determination. The massive show barns, though empty of the champion horses that once filled them, still echo with possibility. The empty mausoleum on the hillside remains, a reminder that even monuments outlive their purpose. But something else lingers here as well, something harder to name. Perhaps it is the spirit of Frank Mars himself, the boy who learned to make candy because his legs would not carry him outside to play. The man who failed and failed and failed until, suddenly, miraculously, he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. The builder who poured his heart into these hills and died before he could see his vision fulfilled. Perhaps it is the ghost of Ethel Mars, who spent 11 years fighting to honor her husband's memory, who won the Kentucky Derby with a 36-1 long shot and still was not there to see it, who gave everything she had and died alone on Christmas Day, far from the place she had called home. Or perhaps what lingers is simply the truth that some places carry within their walls. The truth that wealth cannot buy happiness, that success cannot outrun mortality, that even the grandest dreams must eventually give way to time and change and the turning of seasons. The lessons in the landscape. Milky Way Farm teaches us something about America, about the possibilities that exist in a country where a disabled child from Minnesota can build a candy empire and a Tennessee estate that rivals European palaces, about the cost of that success, measured not just in dollars, but in broken relationships and unfulfilled dreams. About the fragility of legacy, how quickly a kingdom can crumble when its builders pass away. It teaches us something about persistence. Frank Mars failed at least 4 times before he created the Milky Way Bar. 4 bankruptcies, 4 complete collapses, yet he kept making candy. He kept believing that someday, somehow, he would find his breakthrough. It teaches us something about family, about the wounds that never heal, like the rift between Frank and his son Forrest that lasted until death separated them forever. about the bonds that endure, like Ethel's determination to honor her husband's memory, even as her own health failed. And it teaches us something about place, about how certain landscapes can capture our imagination and never let go, about how buildings can become more than buildings, transforming into repositories of memory and meaning that outlast the people who built them. The chocolate estate endures. Nearly a century after Frank Mars first laid eyes on these rolling Tennessee hills, Milky Way Farm still stands, not as the thriving agricultural empire he envisioned, not as the racing powerhouse Ethel created, but as something perhaps more valuable, a window into a vanished world. When visitors cross the threshold of the manor house today, they step back in time. The wooden floors creak underfoot, resurrecting echoes of the past. The 40-foot ceilings soar overhead, a reminder of ambitions that reached for the sky. The massive dining table sits waiting for guests who will never arrive, a silent witness to celebrations that ended long ago. Outside, the magnolia trees still bloom each spring, filling the air with fragrance. Deer wander through the green pastures where prize Herefords once grazed. Wild turkeys scatter across the fields where racehorses once trained for glory. The empty mausoleum still stands on its hillside, its doors now sealed, its purpose unfulfilled. Frank Mars rests in Minneapolis now, beside his wife and eventually his son Forrest, who returned from Europe to transform Mars Incorporated into a global behemoth, but never reconciled with his father before his passing. And somewhere in the silence of Milky Way Farm, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the ghosts of the past whispering their stories. The workers who built these barns with their own hands during the darkest days of the Depression. The horses that thundered around the training track in the Tennessee dawn. The parties that filled the manor house with laughter and music and the clink of crystal glasses. The final reflection. In the end, what was Milky Way Farm? A monument to success? A testament to ambition? A reminder of mortality? Perhaps it was all of these things. Perhaps it was simply a place where one man tried to build something permanent in a world that allows nothing to last forever. Frank Mars spent his childhood watching other children play, while his legs refused to carry him. He spent his young adulthood failing at business after business while the world passed him by. And then, when success finally found him, he tried to create a paradise that would endure long after he was gone. He failed at that too, in a sense. Milky Way Farm did not remain in the Mars family. It did not continue as a world-class racing operation. It fell into decay and nearly disappeared entirely. But something survived. The manor house still stands. The barns still rise from the Tennessee hills. The story still echoes through the generations, told and retold. A reminder that even the sweetest success carries a bitter edge. Today, when you unwrap a Milky Way candy bar or bite into a Snickers, you are tasting the legacy of a sickly boy from Minnesota who refused to give up. When you visit the restored estate in Giles County, you are walking through the dreams of a man who built an empire on chocolate and poured his heart into the Tennessee soil. And when you stand on the grand porch of the manor house, looking out over the same rolling hills that captured Frank Mars's imagination nearly a century ago, you understand something that cannot be put into words. You understand that some places are more than places, some stories are more than stories, and some dreams, even when they fade, never truly disappear. They live on, sweet and bittersweet, like chocolate melting on the tongue, like the memory of paradise, always just out of reach, like Milky Way Farm, standing silent and golden against the Tennessee sky, waiting for someone to remember what it once meant to dream this big. The architecture of ambition. Look closely at the buildings of Milky Way Farm, and you begin to understand the mind that created them. Every structure on the property was designed not just for function, but for beauty. The Tudor Revival style of the manor house, with its half-timbering and steep gables and massive chimneys, spoke of old English country estates. It was a conscious choice, a statement that said Frank Mars had arrived among the aristocracy of America. But the details told a different story. The American chestnut beams in the ceiling, the locally quarried limestone in the walls, the craftsmanship of Tennessee workers who had never seen an English manor house, but understood wood and stone in their bones. This was not mere imitation, it was transformation. European elegance filtered through American determination. The barns told their own stories. Most wealthy horse breeders of the era built purely functional structures, concerned only with housing their animals efficiently. Frank Mars built barns with stone walls and chandeliers and winding staircases. His thoroughbred show barn featured living quarters above the stables, with views across the Tennessee hills that most people would envy in a home. Even the smaller outbuildings carried the same attention to detail. Cottages for workers were constructed with the same care as structures meant for the family. The octagonal barn that still stands today was an engineering marvel, designed to maximize space and light while creating an aesthetically pleasing form. Nothing on Milky Way Farm was merely adequate. Everything aspired to excellence. This was the philosophy Frank Mars had learned in the candy business. Quality mattered. Presentation mattered. The experience of unwrapping a Milky Way bar, of seeing that perfect coating of chocolate, of biting through to the soft nougat center, this was not an accident. It was designed. And so was every aspect of his Tennessee estate. The community that built it. We cannot tell the story of Milky Way Farm without telling the story of the people who built it with their hands. 800 workers at the peak of construction. Most of them local men who had never worked on a project of this scale. Farmers who had watched their crops fail. Laborers who had lost jobs in factories that had closed. Ordinary people facing extraordinary hardship. For these workers, Milky Way Farm was more than a paycheck. It was proof that the world had not completely fallen apart. In an era when bread lines stretched for blocks in the cities, when families were losing their homes to foreclosure, when hope itself seemed like a luxury no one could afford, Frank Mars offered something different. He offered work, real work, dignified work, work that produced something lasting and beautiful. The workers quarried the limestone themselves, cutting blocks from nearby deposits and hauling them to the construction sites. They learned masonry techniques from skilled craftsmen brought in to supervise the most delicate work. They developed expertise they had never imagined possessing, transforming from desperate men seeking any employment into artisans creating a masterpiece. Many of the workers brought their families to live on the property during construction. Children played among the half-finished barns, while their fathers laid stone and their mothers cooked meals in temporary quarters. A community formed, bound together by shared labor and shared fortune. When work ended each evening, men would gather to share stories and speculation about the candy man from up north, who paid so well and asked so much. Frank Mars himself was a presence on the property, walking the grounds with his cane, inspecting the work, offering suggestions and occasionally criticism. Workers remembered him as demanding but fair. He expected the best from everyone because he expected the best from himself. He had not built a candy empire by accepting mediocrity, and he would not build his dream home by settling for less than perfection. The free candy bars became legendary. Workers received them as a small bonus, a tangible reminder that their employer had made his fortune in sweetness. Children would rush to meet their fathers at the end of each workday, knowing there might be a Milky Way or a Snickers waiting for them. It was a small thing, perhaps, but in those hard times, small kindnesses carried enormous weight. The racing dream. When Frank Mars first conceived of Milky Way Farm, he imagined more than beautiful buildings and rolling pastures. He imagined thundering hooves and flying colors and the roar of crowds at America's greatest racetracks. He wanted to breed champions, He wanted to see the green and white silks of his stable crossing finish lines ahead of horses owned by established racing dynasties. The sport of kings, as thoroughbred racing was known, had always been dominated by old money. Families like the Whitneys and the Vanderbilts and the Belmonts had been breeding and racing horses for generations. They owned the best bloodlines. They employed the finest trainers. They occupied the best boxes at Churchill Downs and Saratoga and Belmont Park. Frank Mars was an outsider, a candy maker from the Midwest. New money, and relatively new at that. The racing establishment looked at him with the same skepticism that high society had always directed at self-made men who tried to buy their way into exclusive circles. But Frank Mars did not care about skepticism. He had faced skepticism his entire life. He had been told he would never walk properly. He had been told his candy business would never succeed. He had been told, again and again, that he did not belong in the places he aspired to reach. And he had proven every doubter wrong. He hired the best trainers he could find. He bought the best breeding stock available. He built facilities that rivaled the finest horse farms in Kentucky. And he waited for his horses to prove what he had always known, that excellence could come from anywhere if you were willing to work for it. He would not live to see his dream fulfilled, but Ethel would carry it forward with a determination that matched his own. Ethel's lonely victory. The story of Galahadian's Kentucky Derby victory has been told many times. The 36-1 long shot upsetting the favorite, the jockey's brilliant ride along the rail, the stunning finish that silenced 90,000 spectators. But consider the moment from Ethel Mars's perspective. She had spent 6 years and nearly $600,000 chasing this single victory. She had entered horse after horse, watched them finish second and third and out of the money entirely. She had faced the quiet condescension of established racing families who viewed her as just another rich widow playing at a sport she did not understand. And now, finally, her moment had arrived. Her horse was running in the Kentucky Derby. The odds were against him, but Roy Waldron, her trainer, believed. Carol Bierman, her jockey, believed. The horse himself seemed to sense that something special was happening, and Ethel Mars could not be there. A cold had confined her to bed. A simple illness, the kind that strikes everyone from time to time, but devastating in its timing. She could not travel. She could not stand in her box at Churchill Downs. She could not watch as the race that meant everything to her unfolded. Instead, she lay in her sick room, waiting. Waiting for the telephone to ring. Waiting for news that would either crown years of effort with triumph or extend the heartbreak that had become so familiar. When the call came, when she heard that Galahadian had won, what did she feel? Joy, certainly. Vindication, perhaps. But also something more complicated. She was alone. The victory she had worked so hard to achieve, she had experienced it secondhand, through words relayed over a telephone wire. The crowd at Churchill Downs had seen her horse thunder past Bimelech in the final stretch. They had heard the roar of surprise and disbelief. They had watched the flowers draped over Galahadian's neck in the winner's circle. Ethel had experienced none of this. She had only the knowledge that it had happened. The reality was forever beyond her reach. This seems to be the peculiar curse of the Mars family. Frank built Milky Way Farm, but passed away before he could see it reach its potential. Ethel won the Kentucky Derby, but was not present for the victory. The sweetness of success always came with a bitter undertone of absence. Today, Milky Way Farm still stands in those Tennessee hills. The manor house has been restored. The barns that survived are being preserved. Visitors come for weddings and tours, walking through the same halls where Frank Mars once dreamed of racing glory. The empty mausoleum remains on the hillside, its purpose unfulfilled since Frank's remains were moved to Minneapolis. The massive dining table still sits in the manor house, too large to ever be moved. The magnolia trees still bloom each spring, filling the air with fragrance. And somewhere, In every grocery store and gas station across America, Milky Way bars wait on shelves. Sweet reminders of a boy who learned to make candy because his legs would not let him play. Of a man who failed and failed until finally he succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Of a kingdom built on chocolate that rose and fell and rose again. This is the story of Milky Way Farm. Dark and bright, sweet and bitter. A dream etched in stone. A legacy that endures.